Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel first off. I owe you an apology. This episode took a little longer to get out than planned, but I promise it'll be worth the wait. Tonight we're diving into part 3 of our Arizona True Crime series. If you've been following along, you already know that Arizona has been the backdrop for some of the most shocking and unforgettable cases in American crime history. And in this episode, we'll uncover even more chilling stories that show just how dark things can get even in the desert sun. So grab a seat, make sure you're subscribed, and let's get into these unbelievable cases. Alan Nicholson was 40 years old when he was executed, and at the time of his crime, he was a transient laborer with no fixed address. Born in 1972, to a mother battling addiction, he spent much of his childhood shuttling between juvenile shelters and mental health facilities. His mother, a nightclub performer struggling with heroin, once confined him to a closet and forced him to fight a Doberman for money. By adolescence, he was homeless and self-medicating with stolen prescription pills. In the summer of 1994, he met Dennis Skillicorn at a Salvation Army program in Kansas City. Their shared histories of abandonment and addiction bound them. Nicholson suffered from bipolar disorder and carried the scars of childhood abuse. The impulse for violence lurked beneath his calm exterior, fueled by a lifetime of trauma. On a humid August night, they joined Tim DeGraffenried on a trip east along Interstate 70 to purchase illegal narcotics in St. Louis. Their 1983 Chevrolet Caprice broke down not once but twice. With coffers empty, Skillicorn and Nicholson burglarized a nearby home and stole money, a hunting knife, and firearms to finance a tow. Undeterred by warnings that their car was beyond repair, they climbed back into the dilapidated vehicle. Moments later, Dr. Richard Drummond, a 47-year-old technical supervisor for a tent, spotted them stranded. He stopped and offered a ride to a phone. Nicholson slid into Drummond's Dodge Intrepid, pressed a pistol to the Good Samaritan's temple, and barked directions. The vehicle crept westbound until they veered off onto a rural county road. After roughly 4 miles, they halted by a field at County Road 202. Under a canopy of trees, Nicholson ordered Drummond to kneel and say his prayers. Witnessing the tension, Skillicorn rifled through the stolen goods. 2 sharp cracks echoed through the woods as Nicholson squeezed the trigger twice. Drummond's body lay undiscovered for 8 days. Fleeing on foot with Drummond's car, they pushed west into the Arizona desert, where another breakdown forced them to seek help at a remote ranch. Joseph Babcock, in his 40s, and his wife Charlene welcomed them in good faith. Hours later, Joseph was shot in the back when he turned to drive the men back to their vehicle. Charlene was killed moments after as Nicholson cleared the house. 3 lives extinguished by the same hand that once trembled in fear. Their capture came far from the crime scenes while hitchhiking on a desert highway. Investigators linked the stolen car's GPS data to the Missouri murders. During interrogation, Nicholson confessed without remorse, recalling the euphoria he felt in the woods. Evidence included witness statements, ballistics tests matching the pistol to both crime scenes, and the stolen property recovered at the ranch. Convicted of first-degree murder in a Missouri state court, he received a death sentence. His appeals journey ran through the state Supreme Court and the federal district courts under the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. Concerns over counsel performance triggered a temporary stay, but the United States Supreme Court lifted it in a narrow decision. On December 12, 2013, the state delivered 5 grams of pentobarbital. 8 minutes later, his life ended without final words. Psychologists who reviewed his case highlighted a brutal childhood, untreated mental illness, and a pattern of escalating violence. Experts suggested his actions sprang from a twisted form of retribution against a world that had betrayed him. His own words spoke volumes. "I finally got back for all the beatings I took." In the silence that followed, questions lingered. Can a life scarred by abuse justify taking another? In the dust-choked stretch of Interstate 70, a Good Samaritan's kindness became a grim test of compassion, and the cost was 3 innocent lives. Dennis Skillicorn was 35 when convicted of first-degree murder. Before the murders, he worked odd jobs at construction sites around Kansas City. Raised by an absent father and a mother overwhelmed by her own hardships, he dropped out of high school and drifted into petty crime. He served time as a teenager for burglary and was released only months before the fatal highway encounter. Skillicorn's calm demeanor masked a deep sense of resentment. He and Alan Nicholson crossed paths in early 1994 at a drug rehabilitation center. Skillicorn blamed society for his misfortunes. His own history of violence began with a robbery during which a man lost his life. He was convicted of second-degree murder then and paroled with strict conditions he soon violated. When he joined Nicholson and Tim de Graffenried on the August trip to acquire drugs, he was already teetering on the edge. Their dilapidated 1983 Chevrolet Caprice broke down east of Kingdom City, Missouri. After looting a nearby home for cash and firearms, they returned to the highway undeterred by the mechanic's warnings. At that point, Drummond's Dodge Intrepid appeared. While Nicholson held the pistol, Skillicorn drove. He asked Drummond questions to keep him calm, even joking about whether his old lady would miss him. As they approached a secluded wooded area off a rural county road, Skillicorn disabled the car phone. He helped order Drummond out of the vehicle and watched as Nicholson led him between trees and pulled the trigger. 2 shots, 1 fate. Skillicorn played a supporting role in the murders of Joseph and Charlene Babcock in Arizona. Though he did not fire the fatal rounds, he drove the stolen vehicle and stood guard. When authorities apprehended them in California, Skillicorn initially claimed he was forced at gunpoint, but forensic analysis and eyewitness testimony shattered his defense. In court, he was portrayed as the voice of reason who failed to intervene. The jury heard about his prior murder conviction, his compliance in stocking the stolen goods, and a sworn statement admitting he watched Nicholson kill Drummond. He was sentenced to death in Missouri alongside Nicholson, and later received life imprisonment in Arizona. Defense psychologists describe Skillicorn as someone with antisocial tendencies and poor impulse control. Unlike Nicholson, he showed no euphoria, only a chilling calm. He appeared to see these crimes as transactions, another step in his spiral of criminality. On May 20, 2009, Missouri carried out Skillicorn's execution by lethal injection. He offered no final statement. His last hours passed quietly with no family on hand. The state's shift to a single drug protocol meant pentobarbital delivered his sentence swiftly. Decades later, the ghost of Interstate 70 still haunts memory. A man who once pulled over to help became a victim of 2 hardened criminals. Skillicorn's story is a reminder that sometimes the greatest danger lurks behind a calm voice and a steady grip on the wheel. In the deserted stretch of highway where kindness turned fatal, we are left to wonder what line separates compliance from complicity, and when is silence itself a crime? Charles Howard Schmidt Jr. was 22 years old and living in Tucson, Arizona, on an allowance from his adoptive parents who ran a local nursing home. Outwardly, he appeared polite, intelligent, and athletic, having once led his high school gymnastics team to a state championship before quitting in his senior year. He drove a new car, rode a motorcycle, and cultivated a mysterious persona with jet black hair, heavy makeup, and towering cowboy boots stuffed with paper. To the disaffected teens he befriended, he seemed larger than life and irresistible. Behind the scenes, Schmid displayed a restless streak and a need for admiration that bordered on obsession. He dropped out of school out of boredom, claimed to possess psychic visions, and lied about violent exploits to captivate audiences. He spun tall tales of murders he never committed until the boundary between fiction and reality blurred. Late-night drinking parties on Speedway Road fed his bravado, but beneath the surface he craved control and recognition, signs that his emotional instability teetered towards something far darker. On the night of May 31, 1964, Schmid enlisted 2 friends to lure a 15-year-old girl named Aline Rowe into the desert under the pretense of a date. Deep among dry washes near the golf course, he handed a pointed rock to one accomplice, then watched as the struggle ended in one fatal blow. Moments later, he and his friends dug a shallow grave, buried her under desert sand, and cleansed their car of evidence. Hours later, the desert fell silent once more. When Aline failed to return home, her mother, working a graveyard nursing shift, called the police, only to be dismissed as anxious over a runaway. Norma Rowe sought help from the state attorney general and even consulted a psychic, all while reporters began to sniff out rumors of a teenage sex club. Schmid fueled the controversy with rumors and half-truths, masking the horror beneath layers of adolescent rebellion and teenage drinking. Over the following year, Schmid became entangled with Gretchen Fritz, a 17-year-old daughter of a prominent surgeon, and her 13-year-old sister Wendy. When Gretchen threatened to expose Schmid's earlier crime, he invited both sisters into his home on a summer evening in August 1965 and strangled them to silence. He and a reluctant friend drove their bodies to the same desert hideaway, buried them haphazardly, and watched the ragged edges of their innocence vanish beneath the hot sand. Paranoia seized Schmid's circle when Richie Bruns, once charmed by the Pied Piper's swagger, realized he might be next on the hit list. Torn between fear and loyalty, Richie accompanied Schmid on a second desert excursion where the two unearthed Gretchen's remains under an open sky. His resolve shattered, Richie fled to Ohio and confessed everything to his grandparents, details so chilling that authorities hurried back to Tucson and arrested Schmid the following November. In the grand jury and trial that followed, witnesses painted a portrait of a man who cultivated trust only to betray it. Testimonies from Mary French, John Saunders, Paul Graff, and Richie Bruns wove a narrative of coercion and contempt. Despite motions to suppress pre-trial publicity and late-hour appeals to renowned attorney F. Lee, Bailey Schmid was convicted in February 1966 of double homicide and sentenced to die. A separate case for Aline's murder was delayed until 1967 when he accepted a plea to second-degree murder and received a sentence of 50 years to life after her grave was finally located. Psychologists later described Schmid's motivation as a toxic blend of narcissism, the thrill of domination, and a craving for notoriety. He reveled in the power to charm and destroy, viewing his victims as extensions of his own grandiosity. His attempts to mimic rock star swagger and fabricate mystical powers masked a ruthless need to assert absolute control over life and death. In the end, Charles Schmid's story echoed beyond courtrooms and grave plots. Joyce Carol Oates drew on his peculiar allure to craft a short story about a young girl lured to her doom by a stranger at her door. Schmid's elaborate self-mythology became a cautionary tale about the hidden dangers lurking beneath charismatic facades. As you consider his legacy, a single question remains: how well do we really know the people we admire? In the summer of 2005, behind a strip mall in Antioch, Tennessee, Garland Ray Milam, a 40-year-old drifter living rough in the woods, committed 2 brutal killings in as many days. He later told investigators that he had gotten addicted to sucking the souls out of people and that nothing but execution could stop him. Milam's childhood was marked by upheaval and abuse. Removed from his mother as a toddler, he was raised by an aunt who subjected him to emotional and physical violence. By age 10, he channeled his rage into killing small animals, twisting kittens' necks, and smothering puppies with plastic bags. Those first acts of cruelty foreshadowed the monster he would become. Diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, he drifted from state to state, Arizona, Colorado, Louisiana, Florida, Texas, Utah, hitchhiking, and taking odd jobs, always attempting to outrun the murderous impulses he carried inside. On a humid night in mid-August 2005, Milam strangled 48-year-old Tim McCoy with a money belt in the shelter of a makeshift tent behind the Media Play store on Bell Forge Lane. He forced the belt around McCoy's neck until the man stopped moving, then used a cigarette lighter to ignite the body. Milam told police he wanted the fire to disguise the killing as an accidental blaze, a perverse exhibit of both calculation and callousness. Less than 24 hours later, Milam returned to the same wooded camp and killed his drinking companion, 48-year-old Johnny Paul Davis. When Davis refused to contribute money for beer, Milam looped a dog leash around his neck. He gave Davis a 5-minute head start out of pity, Milam claimed, but the man, too drunk to flee, stumbled and fell. Milam then tightened the leash until Davis's breath faded away. Terrified residents found Milam the next day inside a grocery store confessing to murder and leading officers back to Davis's body. At a preliminary hearing, Metro Detective Roy Dunaway recounted Milam's calm, detailed admission. In court, Milam demanded the death penalty, warning, "I'm going to do it again if I don't get the death penalty." Bail was set at $700,000, and authorities alerted other states to investigate Milam's possible links to unsolved violent crimes, including a machete killing and dismemberment in Tucson, Arizona, which Milam also confessed to in a jailhouse interview. Milam declined a jury trial, pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder, and waived his rights to cross-examination, expediting his path to final sentencing. On January 24, 2007, he received 2 consecutive 51-year prison terms, effectively ensuring he will never taste freedom again. Throughout, Milam displayed no remorse. He described the rush of inhaling a soul as more powerful than any drug, a sensation so intense it threatened to make him lose control of his bowels. He laughed, recounting how McCoy kicked him during the strangulation and boasted that Davis's soul rode the last breath into his lungs. These confessions horrified friends and family of the victims, who insisted that souls belong with God, not in the grasp of a killer. Milam's story forces us to confront the darkest intersections of trauma, mental illness, and unchecked violence. It raises urgent questions. Could early intervention have redirected a broken boy's path? How should society identify and treat wandering souls burning with murderous compulsion? And when a monster confesses without regret, demanding death as his only cure, what does that reveal about the limits of punishment and the depths of human depravity? In the end, the drifter who once roamed 6 states now sits behind bars for life, a grim testament to a mind broken by abuse and deformed by an appetite for death. Yet the unanswered echoes of his confessions continue to haunt the forests of Antioch and the fragile boundary between victim and predator. James Gregory Marlowe was 29 years old when authorities closed in on him in mid-November 1986. A career criminal and ex-convict, he'd spent more than half a dozen years behind bars for robberies, knife-point home invasions, and auto thefts. Known on the prison yard as the Folsom Wolf and proudly inked with Aryan Brotherhood tattoos, Marlowe carried a reputation for violence long before he ever met his partner in crime, Cynthia Lynn Kaufman. Born in 1957 in rural Kentucky, Marlowe was the second of 3 sons in a working-class family. His father held steady work as a factory machinist, but disappeared in a drink after his youngest child arrived. His mother struggled to keep the household together and eventually remarried, leaving James and his brothers to fend for themselves. By age 10, Marlowe had begun shoplifting at the local general store. Teachers described him as bright but volatile, quick to brag, quick to fight. Adolescents found him deeper in petty thefts and scuffles, forging a self-image of danger and dominance. After high school, Marlowe drifted through dead-end jobs. He served 2 terms in state prison for breaking and entering, and then received a 4-year sentence at Folsom Prison for aggravated robbery. It was inside those razor-wire walls that he embraced white supremacist ideology, accepting the Aryan Brotherhood as his new family. On his release in the spring of 1986, Marlowe carried with him not only a sharpened sense of entitlement, but also an unshakable belief in violence as the solution to every problem. In June 1986, Marlowe crossed paths with Cynthia Kaufman at a county jail in Barstow, California. She was 24, recently separated from an unhappy marriage and already tangled in methamphetamine addiction. Their meeting sparked a rapid, destructive bond. He promised her protection and shared his plans for easy money. She craved escape from her own demons. By late October, the two were traveling west in stolen cars, hitching rides on family couches, and setting their sights on the young women who stepped away from ATMs with cash in hand. Over the next 5 weeks, Marlowe and Kaufman struck 4 times. Their method was chilling in its simplicity. They watched bank machines, identified lone women in their early 20s, then followed them to cars or nearby parking lots. Once they had their prey alone, Marlowe wore a suit and tie while Kaufman donned a dress, an unsettling contrast to the violence that followed. He forced his victims into stolen vehicles, handcuffed and gagged them, then strangled them, with a cord sometimes suffocating them in motel bathtubs. 2 of the women showed evidence of sexual assault, though graphic details never made it into court testimony. Victims ranged in age from 19 to 35 each, with her own story of work, family, and routine errands shattered by a stranger's cruelty. Investigators first linked Marlowe's partner to the crimes when an answering machine taken from one victim's apartment surfaced at a pawn shop. A second pawn slip and a fragment of a checkbook bearing Marlowe's and Kaufman's names followed in a landfill near Laguna Niguel. Fingerprints inside a motel room matched Marlowe's long criminal record. On November 14th, a 100-man posse found the couple hiking along a mountain road above Big Bear Lake, still wearing stolen clothes and carrying a brown tote bag stuffed with evidence. They surrendered without a shot, oblivious to how quickly their crimes had unraveled. At trial in San Bernardino County, prosecutors painted Marlowe as the architect of terror. He admitted abducting 3 victims, including a 19-year-old psychology student whose body was found in a Huntington Beach motel, but claimed Kaufman had coerced him into murdering women. Married just weeks before the killing spree, he insisted he only wanted to steal cars and PIN codes. Kaufman, meanwhile, argued battered woman syndrome and imminent threat. The jury rejected both defenses, concluding that Marlowe had intentionally planned and executed the abductions and murders. In August 1989, Marlowe was sentenced to death for the murders of Corinna Novus and Lionel Murray. The California Supreme Court unanimously affirmed his sentence in August 2004, calling the evidence overwhelming and uncontroverted. Today, he sits on death row at San Quentin, his appeals exhausted. Psychologists who studied Marlowe describe him as a classic example of antisocial personality disorder fused with extremist beliefs. He felt invincible, believing that violence would always secure his freedom and power. His partnership with Kaufman provided both a companion and a scapegoat, someone to blame when the world finally caught up with him. Violence is the voice of the wolf, Marlowe once wrote in a jailhouse letter signing off with his Aryan Brotherhood symbol. It remains a chilling reminder that behind every criminal statistic lies a life shaped by abandonment ideology and the desperate need to be feared. On the morning of January 8, 2011, what should have been a quiet community event outside a supermarket in Tucson, Arizona, erupted into chaos and tragedy. 6 people lost their lives, 13 others were injured, and the United States watched in shock as the details unfolded. This is the story of Jared Lee Loughner, a man whose descent from a seemingly ordinary young adult into a mass shooter left a permanent scar on a nation. Jared Lee Loughner was born on September 10, 1988, the only child of a quiet private family. In high school, friends described him as sweet and caring. But after leaving Mountain View High School in 2006, his personality changed drastically. He lost his job at a sandwich shop, was dismissed from volunteering at an animal shelter, and faced 2 minor charges: drug paraphernalia possession in 2007 and vandalism in 2008. After a breakup with his high school girlfriend, he began using alcohol, marijuana, LSD, psychedelic mushrooms, and salvia divinorum. He became obsessed with conspiracy theories, from the 9/11 attacks being an inside job to NASA faking space flights, and developed an intense personal grudge against Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords, which began after a 2007 event where she, in his eyes, didn't answer his philosophical question. In 2010, while studying at Pima Community College, he repeatedly disrupted classes and posted a video calling the school illegal. He was suspended and told he could only return after a mental health clearance. He chose to withdraw. Friends noticed his behavior, becoming stranger with bizarre and disconnected questions. He became fascinated with controlling lucid dreams. On November 30th, 2010, he legally purchased a Glock 9mm pistol. In the early hours of January 8, 2011, he posted a cryptic "Goodbye Friends" message online. That morning, he bought ammunition at Walmart, was briefly stopped by police for running a red light at 7:34 a.m., then took a taxi to the Safeway supermarket in Casas Adobes. At 10:10 a.m. during Gifford's Congress on Your Corner event, he approached and shot her point blank in the head, then turned his gun on the crowd. 6 people were killed, including Chief Judge John Roll and 9-year-old Christina Taylor Greene. 13 others were wounded. Loughner was tackled by bystanders and arrested at the scene. Held in isolation 23 hours a day, Loughner was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Legal battles erupted over whether prison doctors could forcibly medicate him. After more than a year on antipsychotic medication, his mental state improved enough for trial. On August 7, 2012, he pleaded guilty to 19 charges in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. In November 2012, during sentencing, Gabrielle Giffords and her husband, retired astronaut Mark Kelly, confronted him in court. Kelly told him, "You may have put a bullet through her head, but you haven't put a dent in her spirit. You failed." The judge sentenced Loughner to 7 consecutive life terms plus 140 years without the possibility of parole. Some victims addressed him directly, vowing never to think of him again. His parents sat in court devastated. The case intensified debates over political rhetoric, gun laws, and mental health intervention in the United States. Gabrielle Gifford survived but suffered partial blindness and speech difficulties. She returned to Congress temporarily, then resigned in January 2012 to focus on her recovery, promising to continue public service in the future. Today, Jared Lee Loughner remains in federal prison, his actions serving as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of the human cost of violence. In Tucson, the echoes of that January morning still linger. A community forever changed, lives forever altered. And one chilling truth: the signs were there, long before the first shot was fired. Jason Todd Reddy was 39 years old when his name became synonymous with one of Arizona's most horrifying domestic massacres. He was born on February 17, 1973 in Florida, and graduated from Mulberry High School in 1992. Even as a teenager, Reddy clashed with the law, swinging a baseball bat at a car during an altercation and earning a year's probation and community service. After high school, he joined the United States Marine Corps, rising to the rank of Lance Corporal. He trained at Parris Island in the School of Infantry in North Carolina before serving with Reconnaissance Company and 1st LA Oro Bravo Company at Camp Pendleton. Two courts-martial for theft, assault, failure to follow orders, and unauthorized absence ended in brief prison stints of 3 months and 6 months, and in 1996 he received a bad conduct discharge. Following his military career, Reddy poured his energy into anti-immigration militias. He founded both the Minuteman Civil Defense Corps and the U.S. Border Guard patrolling the Arizona-Mexico line with armed volunteers. His public image was a mix of patriotism and extremism. He sang the Ballad of the Green Berets from memory stocked up on rappel ropes he didn't need, and flashed neo-Nazi symbols from his past membership in the National Socialist Movement. He ran unsuccessfully for a seat in the Arizona House of Representatives in 2004 and for the Mesa City Council in 2006. He even mounted a campaign as a Democrat for Pinal County Sheriff, arguing that in a nonpartisan role, party labels didn't matter. All the while, the Anti-Defamation League and the Southern Poverty Law Center tracked his moves, and by 2011, the FBI had opened a domestic terrorism probe into shooting incidents in the desert allegedly linked to militia members. On May 2, 2012, Reddy's vigilante rhetoric gave way to unthinkable violence. That morning inside his Gilbert, Arizona home, he turned a domestic dispute into a quadruple murder. His girlfriend, 47-year-old Lisa Lynn Medeiros, had called 911 earlier that week to report he had choked her during an argument. On this day, she made another distress call, seconds before the line went silent under gunfire. In the next moments, Reddy shot Lisa in the hallway. He then killed her daughter, 23-year-old Amber Neva Medeiros, in the living room, and struck Amber's fiancé, 24-year-old Jim Franklin Hyatt, outside the front door. Inside the house, he fatally wounded 15-month-old Lily Lynn Medeiros. A 16-year-old who hid in the bedroom survived later, describing only the echoes of argument and sudden popping sounds. The crime scene stunned investigators. They found 6 military-issue grenades, a cache of firearms and suspicious chemicals tucked in closets. The Joint Terrorism Task Force, the FBI, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives all joined Gilbert Police in processing the home. When officers forced entry, they discovered Reddy dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head, a single bullet he fired into his right temple. The Maricopa County Medical Examiner confirmed that Reddy was sober and drug-free when he carried out the killings, ruling his death a suicide and the deaths of his victims as homicide by firearm. With no trial to weigh legal arguments, the investigation turned toward motive and mental state. Friends and fellow militia members painted Reddy as fiercely dedicated but volatile. A church deacon who last saw him described a man once baptized into the Lydia community who later called himself a recovering Mormon. Psychologists pointed to untreated trauma from his courts-martial and discharged long-standing rage at authority and an extremist ideology that blurred the lines between patriot and vigilante. The clinical picture suggested a man whose anger, once harnessed for border patrols, exploded in a private act of absolute control. In the aftermath, the community grappled with questions of warning signs and accountability. Neighbors recalled domestic violence calls dating back to 2009. Activists asked why a man under federal scrutiny for extremist violence was allowed to live freely among families. The baby's crib and the mother's overturned chair became silent witnesses to a nightmare born from unchecked radicalization and a history of aggression. When someone who once carried a rifle in the name of national security turns that weapon on the innocent, it forces a reckoning. How do we identify the point at which fervent conviction becomes lethal fanaticism? In Gilbert's quiet cul-de-sac, 4 lives were lost, and a 5th was spared only by hiding in a bedroom. Jason Todd Reddy's story closes on a shattered doorframe and a final question for every listener. When the call goes out for help on our own doorsteps, will we know who to trust and what darkness may be waiting inside? Joseph Rudolph Wood was 30 years old and working odd jobs around Tucson when his long-simmering rage reached a tragic climax. He had once been known as a polite neighbor, the sort of man who mowed lawns and fixed fences without complaint. Raised in a quiet household on the outskirts of town, He rarely spoke of his childhood, though friends recall hints of angry outbursts and sudden withdrawals. Before that August day, Joseph's world seemed ordinary. He went to work, returned home alone, and rarely let people close enough to see the storm inside. In the weeks before the killings, Joseph's relationship with his 29-year-old ex-girlfriend, Debbie Dietz, had unraveled into repeated conflicts and court orders. Debbie had sought a protective order and moved full-time into her family's body shop, determined to keep him at arm's length. Court filings showed at least 2 instances of reported domestic violence, tape-recorded pleas for calm and police visits to break up tense confrontations. Friends and family sensed a man pushed past reason, haunted by rejection and humiliation. Shortly after mid-morning on August 7, 1989, Joseph arrived unannounced at the Dietz family's auto body shop. The late summer sun cast long shadows through dusty windows as Debbie buffed a faded bumper. Her father, Gene Dietz, was on the phone behind the counter when Joseph slipped inside, .38 revolver concealed at his side. He waited for Gene to hang up, then fired once into his chest. Debbie spun around in terror. Before she could react, Joseph seized her, held her tightly, and pulled the trigger twice more, once in the abdomen, once in the chest. Silence fell immediately, broken only by the echo of the last shot. As bullet casings skittered across the concrete floor, Joseph bolted into the glaring daylight. Within moments, 2 officers swept in, guns drawn. They ordered him to drop his weapon. Joseph laid the gun on the pavement, stepped back, then bent down, picked it up again, and aimed. The officers opened fire, striking him repeatedly. He collapsed, breathing shallowly, and soon found himself under hospital care rather than behind the wheel of a patrol cruiser. His arrest was swift, and his trial followed in 18 months. Prosecutors laid out the pattern of stalking, threats, and violence that led up to that morning. Witnesses included a stunned co-worker who described Debbie's panic, a father's last plea for mercy, and police transcripts of the chaotic shootout. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning a guilty verdict on 2 counts of capital murder. The judge imposed a death sentence, setting off a chain of appeals that stretched over 2 decades, with challenges to lethal injection protocols and questions about Joseph's mental competency. All were denied, leading to a final affirmation by the state Supreme Court. Experts who reviewed Joseph's history pointed to deep-seated rejection sensitivity and a need for control. Psychological assessments noted an absence of remorse replaced by cold rationalizations, that he was protecting himself from imagined betrayals. Family members who knew him as a child spoke of unexplained mood swings and a refusal to accept help. In court, his calm demeanor suggested a man convinced of his own justification, an unsettling portrait of obsession and entitlement. And that wraps up part 3 of our Arizona True Crime series. These stories are dark, unsettling, and unforgettable, but they're also a reminder of how much there still is to uncover. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Your support really gives me the motivation to bring you the final part of this Arizona series. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.